Okay, so today we're going to be doing a video where we're going to take 5 authors that I've read a decent amount of their work, and we're going to talk about their original published work, or at least their early published work, and then some of their more recent books. I've chosen to illustrate it this way. I'm not sure why. And we're going to compare. How did they do? What's the growth? What are the changes? How do they look a little bit different? So I'm going to take a look at 4 authors that I love, my personal favorites, some of my personal favorites. Fredrik Backman, Daphne Du Maurier, Jane Austen, and Brandon Sanderson. All of this is going to be spoiler-free. I'm not diving into any spoilers for any of these authors or their works, so you're welcome to hang out with me, whether you've read any from this author or not. But if you do decide to skip around, timestamps in the description. We're going to start with Fredrik Backman. Feels like a good place to start, because his books are within my reach. I have read almost all of Backman's books so far. I think I'm missing 2 of his published books. Maybe only 1. I can only think of Britt Marie Was Here, which I will be reading soon. But I've read all these. His first published book was, oh, I don't own it. I got it from the library. His first published book was A Man Called Ove, and his most recent was Anxious People. Now, admittedly, A Man Called Ove is one of my top 2 favorite Backman books, paired with this one. And Anxious People is probably my least favorite of his. That's not necessarily skill, because I would pair it with this one. It's actually more because of a writing choice he makes in a couple of his books that I personally don't like. So I'm not gonna really cover that in this video, because that's a preference thing, and we're talking about how the author has changed. So let's start with Ove, because that's his first published book. And I think one massive change that Backman has made is in his early book, especially Ove. In his earliest book, it was so character-centric, it was so hyper-focused on one character that Ove has become probably my favorite character in all of literature, in all of fiction that I've read. Because I'm so close to him, I got so intensely close to him in this book that he felt absolutely and completely real. A Deal of a Lifetime is also one of his very early publications. He originally published in a paper, and then later it got published into a book. So I'm not really sure publication order for this, but it was one of his early works, and this one is also very zeroed in on one character and this one character's experiences. He then later zoomed out a lot to focus on a lot more people. So this was later published, but it's one of his earlier written books. So Ove, this, then My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She Was Sorry, then and Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer. That's the order of these books. Then he goes into his Beartown series, and finally Anxious People. So what's interesting is he moves out the further he publishes. So he started and really zeroed in on Ove. Then we have The Deal of a Lifetime, which was also very zeroed in on one character and the few characters that they interact with. My Grandmother, we had one protagonist, but we also got the life of that protagonist's grandmother. And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer, we have 3 people that we're focused on. Beartown is basically an entire town that we're focused on, and Anxious People is also a large group of people that we're focused on. So as he publishes, I'm not talking about his nonfiction because that's different, but as he's publishing, he seems to be zooming out further and further. Now, Ove is one of the best character archetypes and the most personal character archetypes I've read in fiction. Backman perfected that and kept moving out further and further, and he's able to tackle more and more people and be able to still break down the core of humanity, the core of what makes people who they are, and relating to those people. Except now, as he publishes further and further out, he's able to cover more and more people while doing it. Now, personally, I think this zeroing out does a better job of what I see as a very real pattern in all of Backman's books, which is understanding the core humanity of people and relating to each other and giving people room to be flawed and to just understand one another and live happily despite those flaws. And as he zooms out and as he focuses on more and more people, he's able to do that thing that he does in every single one of his books. He's able to do it more effectively because we're seeing more people's life stories, more people's unique perspectives, and he's still able to get his core point across in each book, which is a lot of times tackling really important and difficult topics. But one failing of that, or rather one thing that makes me sad, is the more we zoom out, the more he's able to accomplish with this unique ability that he has, but it also gives us less time in a person's individual story, which makes us a little bit less attached to them and can sometimes make the book feel a little bit more sporadic, make the plot feel a little bit less focused until it all starts coming together, and can sometimes, at least for me, this one felt a little bit more messy. Now, a lot of people still loved this book, so that is very much my personal opinion, but I mean, I'm still gonna read everything he writes. Also prose, he's definitely improved in his prose. In A Man Called Ove, if you haven't hung out with me before, hi, I don't like patterns in my prose. If an author reuses a turn of phrase over and over and over and over again, I die. And he did that in Ove, and I died, but I got over it because it's one of the best books I've ever read. He doesn't do that in future books nearly as much. He still has unique things for each book that he chooses to repeat, but it feels intentional instead of unskilled. Also, you should read Backman. He's amazing. Oh no, this video is gonna be long. I've gotten through one author. Next, let's talk about Daphne Du Maurier, one of my other absolute favorite authors ever of all time. I have read 4 of her books so far. The publication order is Jamaica Inn, directly followed by Rebecca, then Frenchman's Creek, then My Cousin Rachel. I think. I'm pretty sure. That's what Google told me. So that's her publication order of the books that I've read. Well, I really love this book, but I love this one, but I love this one. It's true. She's a good writer. Okay. Some things that I've noticed in these 4 books of hers that I've read that have changed and improved. So Du Maurier is not good at where she wants to place the word love in her books. She writes dark gothic fiction, very immersive settings, very disturbing scenes, and she's a brilliant writer. She's also a brilliant storyteller. Is she brilliant at writing romance? I'd say no. She's great at writing chemistry, but she's really bad at where she puts the word love. Her characters tend to fall in love the moment they meet someone, not after they've had some chemistry. Unfortunately. That did not change in any of these 4 books. At all. In fact, Rebecca was the first book of hers that I read, and I thought that it wasn't supposed to be perceived as love. I thought that it was supposed to be perceived as like this unhealthy obsession, but then I read more of her books and then I realized, I think this is just the way she writes love. But one thing that she has grown in a lot over time, well, okay, first I'll say this. She hasn't changed in that, at least I haven't read her first published book, but at least between the early published books and ones that were a little bit further down the road, her prose is magnificent no matter where you pick up her books, according to the 4 that I've read. Her ability to fully immerse you is extraordinary, no matter what. Her offensive quality of saying love way too soon doesn't seem to change no matter what either. But one thing that I really want to point out that I've noticed is in every Du Maurier book that I've read, she likes to have an open ending. She likes to have here's kind of a close, but also there's a lot of things to speculate on. And 2 books where she did a similar type of ending are Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel. Now, it is completely different in the events that happen, but in the level of open-endedness, these, I think, are great to compare. And I think the skill is clear. The change in skill is clear between these 2 books. In Rebecca, she left it so open-ended that I don't feel like I have a ton of direction for theories and discussion. I have discussed the ending of Rebecca with a few people, and it's kind of just this vague, I think probably this, I think maybe that, Okay, now the discussion is over because we don't really know. But with My Cousin Rachel, she left it so open while still giving us very distinct clues to where I can discuss the ending of this one with people for a long time because there's so many different theories that could come up, and there's evidence for why my theory works for me. And it's a much better discussion piece than this. I think this is too open-ended and even a little messy, whereas this one I think was brilliantly executed. Jane Austen. I've read all of Jane Austen's completed novels. She had some uncompleted books and some short stories. I have not read those yet. So as I understand it, and feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, Northanger Abbey is her first book that she finished, but the last book that was published, or one of the last books that were published. Because she wrote it, I believe, when she was 18, and it was purchased by a publisher, but then sold back to her because they decided not to publish it, and then it was published after her death. Her last two books were Persuasion, which she wrote before death, but it was published after her death, and Emma, which was her last published book before she died. I don't think you can actually see the words on here, so I'm going to stop holding things up. What's interesting is that Pride and Prejudice is her most popular book, but it's one of her earlier works. And I do agree that it's one of her most skillfully executed plots and story full of a lot of commentary and a lot of depth going on behind the scenes, I guess. Sense and Sensibility has a lot of those complexities and a lot of those social commentaries that all of her books have, but it's also one of the more straightforward romances that she writes, which is probably why it's a little bit lower ranked as far as like favorites among the fans, as far as I can tell. Also, it seems like as far as favorites go, her more bold and ostentatious characters, Emma and Lizzie Bennet, those seem to be her more loved characters, whereas her more quiet, like the ones in Sense and Sensibility and Mansfield Park, are her less appreciated protagonists, even though they're also incredible. Sorry, I'm going off. Back to the point. Northanger Abbey is a riot. And you can kind of tell that she wrote it when she was young because it is sassy, but all of her books are sassy. All of her books make fun of the protagonist, but this is untamed. You can tell that she wrote it when she was young. Her humor is still poking fun at her protagonist, poking fun at society, a critical eye on society in her later works, but in Northanger Abbey, her earliest book written, as far as I understand, it's written very I don't really know how to describe it. It's just a wild ride, and her sass, Jane Austen's level of, let me tell you what I think, is very she doesn't hold back. And I would say it grows to be her level of a critical eye on society and a critical eye on the way what's accepted and what's rejected. It becomes more composed and digestible in her later works, and in her early works, it's just fun to read. You can also see a lot of influences in Northanger Abbey. You can see where she took a lot of concepts and she continued to use them throughout. Like, there are certain tropes that Jane Austen uses in most of her books. She uses miscommunication. She uses love triangles. There's a lot of tropes that I typically hate that Jane Austen uses in most of her books that are excellent the way she does them. And you see them in her early works as well as her later works, though she definitely changes the execution of them a lot. And again, I really feel that you can tell in her prose, in her social commentary, in the way she handles her levels of sass, and in her execution of these tropes that she loves and falls back on. All these things, you can just see a lot of honing and a lot of, you just see her skill increase a lot, even though her stories are different and her characters are different from book to book. She uses a lot of the same intentions with her books, as well as a lot of the same tropes. And you see that she becomes so much more skilled as she goes in executing these things. I really don't have much I can say negative about Jane Austen. It's more of just a look into, this is how things have changed, without much of a critical eye. Okay, Sanderson. He's written so much. I'm leaving out Wheel of Time because he was writing based off of another author's notes. He was trying to both keep his own style while also match his icon, the author that he looked up to, match his style, and he did an excellent job at it. But I'm just talking about books that are wholly Brandon's, because we're also talking about character work and plots and all the things that he needs to have done himself for this video. So we're leaving out Wheel of Time. We're only talking about the books of his that I've read. Here we go. We have Elantris. We have the first 2 books in the Skyward series. Mistborn Era 1, I'll be reading Era 2 very soon, and the Stormlight Archive. This will be an interesting one to do because he doesn't even keep his genres. All of Jane Austen's books are similar. There's a good thread there. Du Maurier, she switches genres, but she still is it still works. And Backman, he stays in literary fiction in every instance except for the one where he did nonfiction, and I skipped that for this video. Sanderson writes sometimes standalones, sometimes trilogies, sometimes series. He writes sometimes contained fantasy series. He writes sometimes epics that are so big you need a concordance to help you read along sometimes, or to help you keep up with all the many things that are happening. He writes a lot of adult. Sometimes he writes YA fantasy, and sometimes he writes YA sci-fi. He's everywhere. He does all the things, and he does them very well. So Sanderson, he writes faster than you and I breathe. How do we break down his work? Well, let's go to Elantris, because I think that there's a lot that's changed about him over time, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of commentary. Oh my goodness. I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion because there are hyper fans out there for Sanderson, and I fully encourage you guys to add on to my thoughts. Let's start with plots, because that's something that I think that Sanderson has always been solid at. He's very good, and always has been very good, at being very intentional with what he's writing. From Elantris all the way down, all the way down to Rhythm of War and Starsight, he is able to see everything that he wants to do first and write it out in a way that feels compelling and is easy to read, easy to digest, but at the same time is so complex that when it all comes together, it's such a satisfying climax. However, one thing that's changed is his execution of those concepts. For Elantris and Warbreaker, for both of those, the plot, while is still very good in my opinion, sometimes the execution can be pretty clunky. Sometimes the reveals or the pacing can feel a bit jarring. You can definitely tell what is his earlier work. There's a big difference between Elantris, Mistborn, and Way of Kings, not just in what the books are and what they're trying to accomplish, but just in how smoothly they read. He's always been an incredible storyteller, but as far as his writing abilities, I think his ability to communicate these incredible ideas has improved drastically over time. He's also shifted a lot of focus, even in Elantris, focusing on individuals' life experiences, focusing on a person's inner struggles has always clearly been important to him. But his ability to execute that, his ability to communicate that in very meaningful ways has changed a lot from here to here. I cannot express to you how many times I have heard a person say that they relate to Kaladin's depression. That's not a spoiler. We know it from the very get-go. Relating to Vin's PTSD and her insecurities and her fears can definitely happen, and Vin's a phenomenal protagonist, but it's not as seamless. I've definitely seen some people not be able to relate to her at all, whereas with Stormlight, it seems like everybody can relate to somebody. Whether it be Kaladin, Navani, Shallan, a lot of people relate to Dalinar too, which Dalinar is very well written. His focus on internal struggle, on what's happening inside a person, their emotions, their mental state. This has always been present in his work, but I think, I can't say inarguably in a YouTube video. The comment section will kill me. I think that he has improved in the ability to relate to the humanity of people's internal struggles so much. Even in Skyward, which is a YA sci-fi, I've said many times in my videos that I've never related to a teen girl on the level that I relate to Spensa. I've never read a YA book and teenage Murphy related this hard, but what's been written by this middle-aged man. His ability to see inside what is happening to a person's mind and to their mental state and their internal struggles, and then put that on paper in a very real and relatable way is truly incredible. I'm gonna dip into one thing that I think has changed a lot for me. One thing that's changed a lot from me in a negative way is the way Sanderson describes environment. I felt like where is it? I felt like I was there for Elantris. I felt like I could sense and taste and feel everything that was happening. I know that this isn't how a lot of readers are, but this is how I am. Setting the scene and fully describing environment in a very immersive way, as far as really describing what everything looks like, feels like, tastes like, just really immersing me in a setting is really important for me as a reader, because it helps me to feel fully there and like I can see everything, which helps me retain everything a lot better. That's something that I've actually noticed has not improved. That's something that I've noticed Sanderson doesn't do as much of. In Elantris, I felt like I was fully there. Even though I read this years ago, I can still see everything in the setting of this book. Whereas it seems like as he's moved on, his immersion in settings has changed a lot, to where I no longer feel like I can feel a distinct difference from setting to setting. I feel that in Skyward as well as in the Stormlight Archive. When we move from one location to the next, they're obviously distinctly different places with distinctly different people, but as far as immersion, I never actually feel like I'm fully immersed in any setting. I'm fully immersed with the characters, but I never feel like I'm immersed in settings like I did with his earlier work. Again, I know that not every reader cares about this or even notices this sort of thing, but it is something that matters to me, and it's something that I don't get as much of in his recent books. Now I'm gonna dive back over to plot really quickly as I wrap up Sanderson. I think that Sanderson is much better at really focused plotting. I kind of already talked about execution. It used to be a little bit more clunky. Now I feel like it reads much more smoothly. Even aspects of the Mistborn trilogy can sometimes read really clunkily to me, but in Stormlight Archive, I feel like transitions are much more smooth. I guess the way I want to say this is it feels like his pacing is much more intentional. Stormlight Archive is intentionally very slow and sometimes meandering. He has a huge world, a lot of characters, a ton of side things that he wants to fully explore. It's a little bit too meandering for my taste, but it's still in my top series. I still adore it. But he really shows off his ability to do both with Skyward. He has such tight and intentional pacing, and I guess this just kind of ties back into what I said before about how certain aspects of Elantris and Warbreaker and even parts of Mistborn feel like the transitions, feels like certain pacing aspects end up feeling clunky, whereas even though Stormlight Archive is a bit more meandering and a little bit more slow pace and a little bit more widespread than my personal taste. Again, I still adore this series. Even though that's true, it all feels intentional. It feels like he's doing this on purpose because he has a lot that he wants to share with us. Whereas with Skyward, things are very intentionally, tightly paced, and it shows that he has the ability to do both. It's just about what he's intending to do with a particular series. Whereas with Elantris, with Warbreaker, with parts of Mistborn, I feel like I can see the skill. I can see where he's improved, where the pacing that he's attempting to do is happening. It is being executed, and it reads so much more smoothly than his earlier works did. I hope that makes sense. I would love to see what you guys think. I discussed 4 authors in this video. I'd love to hear how you would interpret it, what you think. What are some things that you think have changed, improved, not improved with any of these authors? If you've read them with some of your favorite authors, I would love to continue the discussion. I post videos every Tuesday through Friday. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.